Back to another episode of Beyond the Mind with Ani. If our last journey led us into the myth of Lilith, the woman who refused to bow, who chose exile over obedience, then today we take the next step into what happened after she was cast out. This episode is called The Birth of Patriarchy, How Power Was Rewritten and Witches Were Born. Across centuries, the same fear that drove Lilith's exile evolved into laws, myths, and institutions that shaped the lives of women for generations. From the witch hunts of Europe to the silent expectation still haunting modern womanhood. This story is not ancient, it is live in our collective memory. Today, we'll peel back the layers of history and ask, when did women's power become dangerous? How did knowledge, once sacred and communal, become something to control? And what does it mean to reclaim it now, in a world that still fears a woman who knows too much, feel too deeply, or refuse to conform? Let's start with one of history's darkest mirrors, the witch hunts. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens and thousands of women were executed across Europe, many burned, drowned, and tortured, accused of witchcraft. But these women weren't evil. Most were midwives, herbalists, and healers, men who held knowledge passed down through generations. They understood the rhythms of the body, the seasons of the earth, and the mysteries of birth and death. They didn't need permission to practice what they knew. There's this book called Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, remind us that these women were the first line of care in their communities. Before hospitals, before male doctors took over profession, women treated fever, infection, and childbirth using herbs and their intuition, wisdom refined over centuries. They knew which plants could stop bleeding, which herbs could ease contractions, and which tea could help a child breathe. They didn't need priests to interpret God or doctors to translate the body. They lived in communion with nature, and that autonomy terrified patriarchal institutions because knowledge is power. And power in the hands of women was something that the new social order could not tolerate. As universities opened their doors to men and shut down to women, a new narrative was born. Medicine became science, and women's healing became superstition. What was once sacred became heresy. The midwives became the witch. Take, for instance, the German city of Würzburg. In the early 1600s, where more than 600 people were executed for witchcraft, many of them women, accused simply because they knew how to mix herbs. Or Scotland's North Berwick trial, where women were tortured into confessing they had called the storm that disrupted a royal voyage, as if the weather itself were under their command. Or the Salem witch trial in colonial America, where teenage girls' accusations led to the hanging of 19 innocents and the erasure of countless reputations. But beneath the fear was something colder and more strategic. Every execution, every public burning was a warning, a reminder of what happens when women step outside obedience. A woman who healed outside the approved system was branded dangerous. A woman who gathered other women was suspicious. A woman who lived alone was wicked. The witch hunts weren't random acts of hysteria. They were organized campaigns of control, a coordinated effort to strip women of their social, spiritual, and economic power and hand the authority to the church, the crown, and male-dominated medical establishments. The echoes of those fires still burn today. This is how women's pain is dismissed in hospitals, how intuition is mocked, how too independent still sounds like warning. Because what the witch hunts truly destroyed was not just lives, but trust. Trust in our bodies, trust cycles, our knowing. And it's that trust we are now reclaiming. After centuries of punishing women for claiming power, patriarchy discovered a subtler and deeply insidious way to manage women: marriage. It wasn't always about love. Often, it was about property, inheritance, and control. A marriage contract could secure land, wealth, or political alliance, ensuring that women's independence was legally and economically restricted. Considered dowries in Renaissance Italy, where a woman's family paid vast sums to secure a husband, literally turning her life into a transaction. Or bride prices in parts of Africa and Asia, where her value was calculated in material terms, binding her to a husband and his family. In England, coverture laws made wife legally invisible. Her property, wages, and even her legal voice were absorbed by her husband. Her body, labor, and consent were assumed, with marital rape unrecognized as a crime for centuries. Obedience wasn't just encouraged, it was mandated, normalized, and enforced by law and custom. And what of women who refused? Those who lived alone, who pursued independence, and who rejected submission were branded spinsters, old maids, witches. In other words, prioritizing herself over patriarchal expectation became a crime of identity. Fast forward today, and these patterns persist, often under softer and subtler names. We call it fear of being alone. Weddings are celebrated as pinnacle of female achievements. We tell women you understand life when you have children, implying that motherhood is the ultimate fulfillment, while quietly shaming those who chose differently. Even the modern pressure to find the right man is the shadow of these centuries-old rules. Women are taught to mold themselves, to perform worthiness, to accommodate, essentially internalizing obedience and self-erasure as strategy. This is the contemporary echo of dowries, bride prices, and social cohesion. Patriarchy didn't disappear. It rebranded itself as tradition, romance, and feminine duty. And the danger is subtle because it feels like a choice when much of it is inherited conditioning. The myth of Lilith and Eve are more than ancient stories. They're templates for control, blueprints for how society teaches women to behave. Lilith, the first woman, said no. She refused to lie beneath Adam, demanding equality, autonomy, and the right for her body. For that, she was cast out, demonized, and made a symbol of female danger. Eve, the second woman, said, "Why?" She ate from the tree of knowledge, seeking curiosity, wisdom, and awareness, and was punished for it. These stories weren't merely moral tales, they were social instruction manuals. Disobedient women bring chaos. Knowledge in the hands of the feminine is dangerous. Submission is safety. Obedience is survival. The lesson were reinforced subtly and painfully. Over time, they became cultural scripts, whispering into every corner of society, into law, literature, religion, and eventually media. For example, in medieval Europe, women who read, wrote, or studied were suspected. Literacy in women were feared as a doorway to independent thought. Early modern witchcraft trials targeted women who defined social norms, spoke their minds, or practiced medicine and healing. Even in Victorian England, women were told that ambition or sexual desires were unfeminine. Stepping outside these confines were moral failures. When a woman raises her voice at work, she's labeled difficult or bossy. When she embraces her sexuality, she's called too much or promiscuous. When she prioritizes her career and personal growth, she's branded cold or selfish. When she chooses to remain single or child-free, she's lost or pitied. Even movements that claim empowerment can reinforce these narratives. Consider the lean-in culture. Women are encouraged to succeed, but only by performing within male-defined system, adopting traits praised in men but still judged harshly when exhibited by women. The story of Lilith and Eve didn't end in myth. They became encoded in expectations, judgment, and internalized beliefs. Every time a woman hesitates to speak her truth or a man gasps at the woman's confidence, these ancient templates are at work. We still live in Eve's shadow and Lilith's exile. The curiosity punished, the autonomy feared, the rebellion demonized. And recognizing these patterns is the first step to reclaiming power. And yet, through every era of suppression, women found ways to remember, resist, and preserve knowledge. Long before modern feminism, women were the custodians of wisdom, ensuring that knowledge of life and death survived when laws and priests sought to control it. Herbalists disguised medicine as kitchen work, blending healing with domestic labor so that the science of plants could continue quietly under patriarchal oversight. Writers like Christine de Pizan in 1405 defined male philosophers by publishing the book The City of Ladies, challenging the notion that women were intellectually inferior and documenting women's achievements and wisdom for future generations. And in Scotland and Germany, women passed knowledge orally through songs, lullabies, and stories, so that even when literacy was forbidden, the wisdom of the feminine survived. Even small acts of creativity were acts of rebellion. Embroidery, patterns that contained symbol of protection, recipes that healed, and folk tales that encoded moral and practical lessons. This resilience wasn't just survival, it was subversion. It was women claiming space for themselves in worlds that systematically denied them authority. Every whispered secret, every hidden formula, every coded story was a spark of freedom. And modern echoes today? Today, women reclaim resilience by trusting their intuition, by saying no without guilt, by choosing rest in a culture that glorifies overwork, and by demanding space and recognition even when labeled too much. Think of women launching businesses from home, mentoring other women in secret networks, or creating online communities where voices long silenced are finally heard. Every Instagram post, tweet, or podcast episode about reclaiming female power is a modern version of passing down that hidden wisdom. And yet, even as a generation of women quietly preserved their power and wisdom, society continued to whisper that compliance was safer than courage. A whisper that echoes today in subtler pressure to please, perform, and seek approval. For centuries, women were taught that their value was dependent on appeasing men, staying acceptable, and avoiding anger or independence. This wasn't just survival. It became a psychological inheritance. Today we see it in what's called the pick-me girl syndrome. Women who constantly perform, diminish themselves, or compete for male approval, fearing being alone or labeled too much. She laughs at what she doesn't really think it's funny because she wants a man to notice. She hinders her ambition or knowledge because it might intimidate him. She accepts mistreatment silently to avoid conflict. This is the modern echo of Lilith's exile. Obedience as safety, submission as survival, and yet, in doing so, she internalizes that chain of patriarchy, turning them against herself and other women. Sisterhood and solidarity are replaced by competition for validation, as if freedom is a reward, not a birthright. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, unmarried women, unspoken midwives, or women who defied male authority were often labeled as witches, criminals. Obedience was a way to survive. And even today, social media, dating culture, and even workplace dynamics subtly reward compliance and punishes independence, and teaching women that being palatable is much safer than being fully themselves. So, my lovely listeners, what if we remembered that the womb is not just for birth, but for creation of art, ideas, and movements of truth? What if Eve wasn't punished for sin, but for daring to awaken? Patriarchy has always feared women who knew themselves. That fear hasn't disappeared, it has simply evolved. It whispers in social media comments, in workplace bias, in subtle family expectation. But every time we question a narrative, every time we reclaim our softness and our fire, we undo a little piece of that spell. Every act of self-knowledge, self-love, and self-expression is a rebellion, a continuation of a lineage of women who refuse to be erased. So I want to thank you for being here and for listening and for questioning, remembering, and rising. If this episode resonated with you, please like, share, and leave a comment. Awareness spreads like fire, and every woman who remembers her power becomes impossible to silence. So until next time, stay bold, stay fierce, and true to yourself, and always go beyond the mind.